Previously on the Munros, a personal voyage. In Knives in the Dark, we explored the ruthless machinations of the Master of Stair and his minions in his quest to engineer a genocide of the Glen Coe MacDonalds, and how good men failed to act to prevent the atrocity of the 13th of February 1692, to which we now turn our full attention. The attempted genocide of the Glen Coe MacDonalds was a disaster not just for the victims, but for the aggressors also. Few of the objectives the Master of Stair, John Dalrymple, had specified were achieved, and, as John Hill had predicted, in the long run the whole operation had the opposite effect to that intended. Far from destroying the Jacobite cause, in time it would serve only to reload it. When news of this ugly debacle reached London and, thanks to the printing press, Europe, William and his government were exposed for the petty gangsters they really were. But why did Stair's long-fermenting plan fail? We know Duncanson's mysterious last-minute change of orders undermined the plan, but it was compounded by the indefatigable power of nature, perhaps even the mythical Cailleach herself, that fatefully intervened to both disrupt the murderer's advance and, far more cruelly, the victim's attempts to escape. It's time to put on our detective hats and don our big coats to investigate the horrific events of February the 13th, 1692. On the morning of February the 1st, 1692, the small stretch of water at the mouth of Loch Leven was broken by small boats, bearing 120 men of the Argyll Regiment of Foot across to the southern Appin shore, under the command of Captain Robert Campbell of Glen Lyon. Robert Campbell was a man ruined by alcoholism and gambling, but also by the raids of the Lochaber MacDonalds, as we saw in Guardians to Gallows Herd. He was by now destitute, improvident, and greatly disliked by other Campbells for, among other things, his gambling debts and his Jacobite sympathies. These included his oft-bothered uncle, Grey John, or the Earl of Breadalbane, who we met in Knives in the Dark, who commented, "He is an object of compassion when I see him, but when he's out of sight, I could wish that he had never been born." Hamilton, the Deputy Governor of Fort William, and Duncanson, the brutish commander of the supplementary Argyll men at Ballachulish, shared the latter of these sentiments. This was why Robert Campbell had been selected for the task they had planned. It was not that Duncanson and Hamilton rated his leadership or instincts, far from it, but because their plan was likely to be discussed afterwards, and Glen Lyon was a convenient patsy should scandal arise. On paper, he certainly had the motive, the means, and the poor reputation to boot. The perfect setup. The men under Robert Campbell's command would not have been unaware of Glen Lyon's standing, and this renowned feckless drunkard would hardly have inspired much confidence or professionalism among his troops. Likely huddled and shivering in the bracing sea air, the soldiers knew only that they were to be quartered in Glen Coe in advance of an attack upon the miscreant Glengarry. Now, we know that this was nonsense, but geographically it also doesn't make a whole lot of sense, given that Glengarry's stronghold of Invergarry was literally in the opposite direction from Glen Coe from Fort William. But they likely figured needs must as the devil drives, and as we know, their orders were fairly uncompromising on the matter. While some of the Perthshire men among the companies may have relished the prospect of putting the Herd Widifice in their place, most Highlanders among the ranks likely saw this as just another assignment for their Campbell overlords. There is no evidence that the infantry themselves had any knowledge of the actual endgame. Indeed, given the plan's barbarity, it's most likely that they were deliberately kept in the dark to prevent them from refusing, revolting, or giving the game away. Upon landing at the old pier at Ballachulish, Glenlyon's 120 men began the march along the lochside towards Carnoch, seat of the old fox Alistair MacIain, Lord of the Gallows Herd. Around roughly what's now called Ballachulish, however, they halted, confronted by around 20 armed men in a single wide line, bearing the MacDonald tartan and the iconic sprig of heather in their bonnets. Lieutenant Lindsay, who carried the letter from Hamilton informing MacIain of the quartering of the regiment upon his bounds, stepped forward on Campbell's command to present the men's leader with said document. Before him stood John MacDonald, the eldest son of MacIain. The approach of a large number of armed, red-coated soldiers marching towards Glen Coe from the west had been noted well in advance. John MacDonald and his advance party were unpleasantly surprised to find that the captain of the interlopers was none other than the man whose lands and personal possessions his family had recently pillaged. As the two sides regarded each other in the crisp morning light, Campbell cows, or kye, steamed in MacIain's byres, Glenlyon's prized red stallion stood in his stables, and even the copper kettle of Robert's wife hung over Lady MacIain's fire. To add insult to injury, it was largely only because MacIain and company had stolen his only remaining means of income that Glenlyon, a Jacobite sympathiser remember, had had to enlist in William's service in the first place. As they say, awkward. John MacDonald refused to take the letter Lindsay proffered him. "Do you come as friends," he asked distrustingly, "or as enemies?" "As friends," Lindsay answered, and the son of MacIain begrudgingly took the document, holding the lieutenant's eye. Now, given that there wasn't much cause for them to be speaking or reading English, it's likely that this document would have been barely legible to him beyond a few key words. At this point, Glenlyon presented himself. He greeted John MacDonald with an exaggerated friendliness and good cheer, asking after his niece Sarah, who lived in the glen, and her husband Sandy, and even introducing Lindsay as one of his kin, to foster the sense that everyone was family here. Glenlyon lamented the state of affairs in which men must ask such favours of each other, but Fort William was full, and if MacIain and his kin would be so kind as to accommodate their men, it would be a much appreciated service. Campbell's good cheer was of course overwrought and performative, but despite his history with the MacIains, he didn't necessarily harbour a hostile attitude towards John MacDonald in this situation. Glenlyon knew that he had been picked for this assignment because his superiors didn't like him, and the feeling was almost certainly mutual. Glenlyon was no eager mercenary filled with patriotic vigour or vengeful pride. He just wanted to get this unpleasant business over with. Remember, he had no certainty at this point of what Hamilton and Duncanson's plans really were, and would not for 12 days hence, on the very night before they were to be enacted. Campbell told John MacDonald that he had come to quarter his men in Glen Coe as per the law. Tenants were of course obliged to accommodate troops in times of war as service to the state. This would work for the MacIains too, as they would be able to pay back some of their tax, that is rent, and now actual tax with an X, that they owed to their landlord, the Earl of Argyll. Yep, the same guy whose private militia were now standing over 100 strong behind Robert Campbell of Glenlyon. This was an offer John MacDonald couldn't refuse, but it was at least made politely. "You and your men are welcome in Glen Coe," he said, politically, and as his men broke away to carry the news, he walked beside Glenlyon to his father's house at Carnoch, known to the Glens folk as the Big House. Word had soon reached MacIain at Carnoch, and swiftly filtered through the rest of the glen, to be met with at best apprehension, and at worst all-out panic. Few took the word of this Campbell whom they had robbed so thoroughly, and many prepared arms, ready for defence. MacIain, however, was putting his best diplomatic face on, and met the king's company at the Bridge of Coe. He understood that the terms being presented provided him with a way out of his legal and financial predicament, and sent word to his men and their subtenants that the soldiers should be met with the traditional Highland hospitality, irrespective of the formal military orders. He made it clear to them that it was very important no serviceable arms were to be taken up against Campbell's regiment. Indeed, only rusted and useless weaponry should be on display, because the soldiers may in fact decide to confiscate the MacIain's means of resistance, and this way they would end up with a pile of quote rusty junk. This missive was respected despite his sons and many other folks in the Glen's reticence to believe that the billeting was truly a simple matter of logistics. MacIain bid Robert Campbell reside with him at the big house in Carnoch, but despite Glenlyon's expensive tastes, he insisted he could not impose on the chief any more than necessary, and instead took up residence with MacDonald of Inverrigan, a short distance away on the other side of the Coe. It's quite possible that Campbell didn't trust MacIain, or at least could not stomach being served with his own stolen property. Lieutenant Lindsay, however, had no such qualms, and decided to enjoy MacIain's comfortable dwelling. The majority of the government force, including Sergeant Barber, no relation, honest, were billeted at the residence of MacDonald of Achnacoona, at the elbow of the Glen, with additional troops quartered upon his brother's township of Achtrichten, the Clachan of the Bards, nestled beneath the Gothic cathedral of Ernich Eich. Others were housed at Brecklet and Larach, as well as other single cottages throughout the Glen. Depending on the size of the dwelling, each house berthed between 3 and 5 soldiers. The records we have of the 13 days that the men occupied Glen Coe tell only of 3 officers: Captain Robert Campbell, Glenlyon himself, Lieutenant John Lindsay, and Sergeant Barber, as well as the non-commissioned officer Ensign John Lundy. However, we can speculate as to the other officers present by examining the last surviving muster roll of Glenlyon's company. These would likely have included Barber's junior sergeant James Hendry, as well as the grenadier sergeants Walter Purdy, Walter Buchanan, and Walter Bruss. Guess Walter was the inn name that month. There would almost certainly have been 3 corporals and 2 drummers per company. These men were mostly from the Lowlands, while the remaining 2/3 of the total contingent bore Highland surnames, and as we saw last time, these were tenants of the Campbell Earl of Argyll's lands, conscripted as per the proverbial small print in their rent agreements. As one might assume, the men were initially welcomed by the MacDonald in only the most anaemic sense of the word, with no little reluctance and great discomfort. But on consideration, the senior tacksman reasoned, albeit bitterly, that MacIain might not be wrong in seeking security for his people by acquiescing to the billeting orders. But some could not and would not be convinced that this was not some new skullduggery by the Williamite government. The days became unseasonably mild through the first week of February. In the crisp air of mornings, military drills were conducted until 12, most likely to the amusement of the local children. Why were these men in silly red uniforms getting up so early just to march around to English orders for the sake of it? Maturer observers, however, viewed the military exercises with a gnawing sense of discomfort. What exactly were the soldiers preparing for? What was behind this facade of friendliness? The tang of mortal danger that seemed to hang in the air as the drumbeats and shouting of the officers reverberated against the walls of the Glen. Greatly disquieted, 100 residents went to MacIain's house and asked him to have the soldiers leave the Glen, but MacIain angrily refused, telling them that the Argyll men were to be treated with honour. They were Highlanders who had broken bread with the Clan Abrach, and as such, they were operating under trust, an important and ancient tenet of Highland hospitality that even a host's bitterest enemies would duly uphold. This may seem rather quaint to us now, but despite the feuding of the age of the forays, betraying a host while accommodated under trust, that is, stealing from or harming them and their kin in any manner, was simply unthinkable to any Highlander. The petitioners were mostly reassured by MacIain's words. Mostly. Once the folk of Glen Coe had got used to their new tenants, the ice began to break and the soldiers made more welcome. Of course, the lowland men were still viewed as alien outsiders, but even these were treated with respect. The Highland men among the ranks, however, were of course afforded a great deal more chivalry. After all, there was blood on both sides. While many of the soldiers had been robbed by their hosts, so too had the MacDonalds been aggrieved by the state and its Campbell enablers. These differences were set aside out of mutual respect as Highlanders. This was the Highland code of hospitality that the Master of Stair knew all too well was ripe for abuse. When not performing drills, the government troops whiled away the afternoons and evenings enjoying the hospitality of their hosts, wrestling, tossing the stone and caber, and the brutal games of camanach or shinty, so called for the likelihood of having one's shin bones broken by the stick. There was archery, a skill at which the Glen folk greatly prided themselves, and the traditional dancing on crossed swords to the strains of the bagpipes. In the evenings, with the sergeants on watch, the men partook of the peaty ushka, the infamously strong Highland whisky, played cards, and were regaled with tales of Finn MacCool, and joined in with, presumably carefully chosen, songs. Remember, all but a select few of the officers, most likely Lindsay and Barber, were unaware of the true intent behind the billeting. As we saw in Knives in the Dark, the vast majority of the Argyll regiment were not Campbells, but of various central Highland clans, and while they would not have held MacIain and his people in particularly high regard, nor did they harbour the bottomless pit of vitriol that characterised the Campbell attitude towards MacDonalds. As mentioned previously, Glengarry, the soldiers' supposed target, submitted to William on February the 4th, 4 days after the troops' arrival in Glen Coe. Word of this was not passed from Fort William to Robert Campbell because it would have revealed to him that the supposed move against Glengarry was nothing more than a ruse, and his superiors certainly had no faith in Campbell to do what he was told if he had time to ruminate on the hideous act that he was really there to commit. Each morning Glenlyon visited his niece Sarah and shared a dram with her husband, Alistair Og, MacIain's younger son. He spent most evenings gambling at cards and backgammon long into the night with Inverrigan and MacIain's sons, often returning to his house at dawn after he had drunk his opponents under the table and or his luck had deserted him. MacIain himself would regularly invite Glenlyon to dine at Carnach, the hospitable house of wine cups and panelled walls. Their drinking sessions were accompanied by the piping of Big Henderson of the Chanters, and they were often joined by MacIain's other guest, Murdoch Matheson, a young bard and poet who had stopped off in Glen Coe on his way home from Inverera. Matheson later described MacIain as a hero without flaw, without fear, unsurpassed in beauty or in eloquence, which is perhaps overdoing it a tad. Matheson gave shorter shrift to the Argyll militia joining him at the dinner table, however, describing them as uncouth savages, mulish louts, and folk who puff out their cheeks as they sit on stools. God, yeah, I hate people who do that. 7 days had now passed since the soldiers had entered Glen Coe. Hamilton had likely envisaged the operation being carried out within a few days of arrival, but the final orders were being delayed. The reason for this was John Hill, who was keeping his deputy Governor Hamilton waiting as he held out for clarification of these horrible orders from the Master of Stair. Good luck with that. Another 5 days would pass before he received the terse riposte: "You cannot receive further directions. Be as earnest in the matter as you can. Be secret and sudden. Be quick." Hill's last attempt to avert the massacre failed. As we saw in Knives in the Dark, he could still have disrupted proceedings at this point, but fearful of the consequences for him and his family, he grudgingly signed the genocidal order. Over the preceding 5 days in Glen Coe, those MacDonalds, unconvinced by MacIain's reassurances, had taken the opportunity to quietly vacate their abodes. The migration of the less credulous residents from Glen Coe to the surrounding glens and clachans was carried out where possible under cover of night, while the Argyll men slept. It's estimated that there were on average around 500 people living in Glen Coe when the soldiers arrived, but this would have decreased to between 300 and 400 by Friday, February the 12th. The morning of the 12th was cool and still as Glenlyon met MacIain at a change house in Invercoe, and the two drank in good cheer, MacIain inviting his guest, as well as Leslie and Lundy, to dine with him at Carnoch the next evening. The wind began to howl over the hollows and crags of Inich Éich. The temperature had fallen throughout the day, and the dark grey pall of storm clouds were gathering at the edges of the sky. Later, folk told of the signs and portents apparent that day. By the loch at Ballachulish, they said, men claimed to have sighted Anduine Mór, the great grey man of legend who appeared when the descendants of the Féin were in trouble, while at Invercoe a herd of cattle stampeded up the hillside, despite there being nothing seen to scare them. The Bianie, the mythical old washerwoman who cleaned the same shroud over and over, was said to have been spotted near the waterfalls of the Coe, a strong portent of bloodshed. Most ominous, however, was the Keening woman, whose otherworldly cries of lament had been heard over the last few nights in the glen, a very bad omen indeed. But there is no evidence that MacIain himself felt any unease. In the evening, his sons John and Alistair Oak MacDonald, having apparently come around to the veracity of Campbell's word, visited Glenlyon at Inverrigan to drink and gamble. Campbell, his nose and face already flushed with wine, greeted them cheerfully, and they drank and played cards by the fire. Glenlyon mentioned that he had been invited to dine once more at the big house the following evening. As night fell in earnest, Thomas Drummond, the same shadowy figure who had detained MacIain at Hogmanay in Knives in the Dark, arrived with Duncanson's infamous order, and Drummond would almost certainly have been aware of its contents, that is, the fascistic missive to wipe out the MacIains root and branch. As we know, the letter was not phrased in such a way that implies its reader would be aware of, much less a willing party to, its instructions. Duncanson piles on the thinly veiled threats, alluding to Glenlyon's prior misdeeds and leaving no uncertainty as to the misfortune that Campbell would suffer upon failing to carry out the orders. Upon Glenlyon's reading this grim correspondence, he simply folded up the orders and put them in his pocket. Campbell made his excuses to leave and disappeared into the night to locate his officer of the watch. Outside, the wind was becoming savage and the snow gathering swiftly underfoot. Glenlyon began to disseminate the orders to his men, and this had to be done away from the houses and their prying ears, whispered above the howling wind, darkness the only witness. The word of the 5 o'clock muster made its way quietly west to Invercoe and Larach and east to Achtrichten. The work was finally at hand, whatever that might entail. Even now, the truth was being withheld from the infantry. The men were told only to be ready for 5 AM. But ready for what? There were many stories told in the years to come of how the soldiers supposedly gave subtle hints to the glensfolk, and some not so subtle. These are almost certainly fictitious, but there remains the romantic possibility of an informed officer having a crisis of conscience towards his defenceless quarry. The evidence, however, suggests otherwise. I knew nothing of the design of killing the Glen Coe men till the morning that the slaughter was committed, at which time the companies were drawn out and got orders from Glenlyon and our other officers to shoot and kill all the countrymen we met with. James Campbell, a member of the infantry, later swore under oath at the inquiry. Privately, Glen Lyon was reeling in horror. Only now did the sheer scale and depravity of his superior's intent become apparent to him. Hitting like a cannonball to the stomach, he realised just how much Duncanson and Hamilton hated him. He was being used to commit a crime so unthinkable his superiors could not be seen to be connected with it. Too late, Glen Lyon saw all too clearly the pieces fall into place. He was to be their fall guy, and about to gain a reputation darker even than that of his genocidal ancestor Black Duncan of the Cowl. Robert Campbell was on the business end of a cruel and spiteful piece of political skullduggery that he knew no one in Scotland would ever forgive him for. Duncanson's rogue order to Glen Lyon to muster the men at 5 of the clock instead of 7 was pretty much instrumental to why the planned massacre failed in its main objectives. There would be no backup for 2 hours, and thus both ends of Glen Coe would remain open to egress until 7 at the earliest. The meticulously planned operation had been fundamentally compromised at the last minute, for reasons we will never know, but we can certainly speculate. Despite Hamilton's direct orders to march into Glen Coe and assist Glen Lyon in the murderous task, Duncanson likely had no intention of being associated with the dark orders he had so vociferously impressed upon Robert Campbell. The change to 5 cannot have been a mistake, for he repeats it. We can infer then that he planned to arrive later, as per the original plan, at 7. In other words, once the deed had been done. Duncanson saw the opportunity to have the ugly affair associated with the old Campbell drunkard. To be clear, while Hamilton had a similar aim, he certainly didn't intend Robert Campbell to have to carry out the orders alone. Duncanson's translation served only Duncanson himself. Glen Lyon did not order men to blockade the road at Brecklet because he had been assured Duncanson would seal it with his advance from the west. Eastward, beyond the awkward pass of Glen Coe, lay Rannoch Moor, a no man's land in winter, and besides, Hamilton's companies of Hill's regiment were to advance over the Devil's Staircase to cut off this escape. And then the snow began to fall in earnest. Winter had returned in all its savagery. The blizzard soon reduced visibility to near zero, and all in the glen disappeared into shelter. Some for the last time. The blizzard intensified throughout the night, driving snow into great drifts on the slopes of Achtrichten and icing the already awkward slabs of the pass of Glen Coe. Nature was not playing ball. Nevertheless, and for all his revulsion and reluctance, Glen Lyon took no chances in meticulously adhering to his orders. He must have risen no later than 4 AM on the 13th, rallied his men outside the cottage, then set them about incapacitating, but not killing, for it was not yet 5, Inverriggen and his household, binding, gagging and placing them in the byre section of the cottage. This done, he could then direct the killing without advance word getting out. At roughly 4:30, John MacDonald, eldest son of MacIain, was awakened by shouts and lights from outside his cottage. He saw the redcoats assembling, the blaze of pine knots and the glint of weaponry in the night. Again they shouted, this time perhaps towards him, but before he could dress and get outside, they had departed. John went to reassure his wife, and once she slept, he made his way stealthily through the blizzard, battling the wind and snowdrifts to Inverriggen. Here there were more men, more torches, and more weaponry being readied. The redcoats eyed him as he made his way to Inverriggen's house. The main room was full, the air close with gunpowder, and instead of Inverriggen, he found Glenlyon and his men readying their weaponry. John demanded to know why the soldiers were abroad and readying arms at such an hour, with such dreadful conditions outside. Thinking on his feet, mainly because in the byre, behind a thin cowhide, the household of Inverriggen lay gagged and bound to be slaughtered forthwith, Glenlyon affected a light-hearted tone, bemoaning the soldier's life of duty and such ungodly hours of service. He explained to John MacDonald that they were at last away to deal with Glengarry, and that the burden of accommodation upon the MacDonalds was about to be lifted. One of these statements was true, but John MacDonald made a face that suggested he wasn't buying either of them. Glenlyon knew he had to step up his game. "Do you think we intend Glen Coe some ill?" he comforted. "Is that it? Man, if that were my orders, do you think I'd have given no warning to my niece and to your brother Sandy?" Glenlyon, skilled in the arts of deception, knew that showing defensiveness or betraying any ill temper would have given the game away. MacDonald was already dismayed at the smell of gunpowder, the assembly of men, and the sight of the glinting bayonets. Only the calmly delivered logic that no Highland man would knowingly have his own women slain, Glenlyon reasoned, would get rid of John MacDonald at this point. He was correct. MacDonald accepted this explanation, shook Glenlyon's hand, and returned to his house to sleep. When 5 AM came, the storm was raging, a whiteout blizzard howling as the soldiers began the killing. The first casualty was Duncan Rankin, who ran from his cottage by the big house in Carnock towards the River Coe, where he was shot down and his body carried into Loch Leven by the current. Another man made a heroic leap across the river and survived despite being wounded. The old fox Alistair MacIain himself was the first MacDonald to die, and he was afforded little dignity in his last minutes. At 5 o'clock, Lieutenant Lindsay hammered on the door of his house and called to MacIain in a friendly voice. Alistair MacDonald was alerted by a servant that the men were leaving and wished to thank their hosts for their kindness. Thinking that they were likely leaving on an early march northwards, MacIain went to hastily pull on his woolen trews and overshirt, ordering his servants to make ready a warming dram for the departing Glenlyon and his men. MacIain was standing by his bed with his back to the door when the soldiers streamed into the house and began to carry out their diabolical directives. Lindsay burst into MacIain's bedchamber and shot the old man in the back and in the back of the head, the latter destroying his face through the exit wound. MacIain's wife screamed but was thrown aside and clubbed by rifle butt as her husband's bloody, half-clothed body was dragged out onto the ground before the house for display. The soldiers tore the clothes from Lady MacIain until she was naked, and, this is the really classy bit, gnawed the silver rings from her fingers. The next objective was to eliminate the sons. John MacDonald was roused by a servant shortly after 5, and after a terribly sleepless night, didn't need to ask why. From his door he saw in the blizzard a troop of soldiers approaching the house, bayonets that he had seen earlier ready for action. He wasted no time in gathering his family and exiting the house, the party making their way up the hillside of Miel Mor to the tree line, where they chanced upon his father's servant Archibald MacDonald and Murdoch Matheson the bard, both of whom filled him in on the terrible events at the big house from which they had fled. None had adequate clothing to protect them from the savage wind chill as the gale steadily began to siphon off their body heat. Alistair Og, the younger son, was also shaken awake by his servant. "It's no time for you to be sleeping when they're killing your brother at the door," they said. Alistair Og quickly gathered his family and they made for the slopes of Miel Mor in little more than their bedclothes. By chance they happened upon his brother's party and the pair from Carnock, and together they huddled in the corrie, shivering and wishing that this was all just a very bad dream. The storm, however, showed no mercy. There was no shelter but that occupied by the enemy. The wind was freezing their exposed flesh, and the snow was thickening around them. Occasionally, a break in the clouds would show a glimpse of the destruction occurring in the floor of the glen. A house aflame, a flash of a musket round, a pillar of black smoke. The sound of shouting and gunshots reverberated around the glen. There was no way out. Eventually, John and Alistair Ogue sent the women and children around the shoulder of Miaul Mór down into Glen Leach na Muille, for as dawn approached, their perch would soon be visible. The brothers, along with Matheson and Archibald, then traversed the hillside north to above Inverriggen, where they found other women and children who had fled Inverriggen and sent them south to Glen Leach na Muille. Lady MacIain, whose name is sadly lost to history, was among the survivors from Carnoch, likely dressed only in what others could spare her. She was sent to Glen Leach na Muille with the rest of the women and children, but would not survive the night. At Inverriggen, Glen Lyon had observed the coming of 5 o'clock on his pocket watch, which he then snapped shut. He had the trussed captives taken out from the house to the manure heap outside. Here, Glen Lyon shot his host Inverriggen, and his men executed the rest. Just as the last captive was about to be shot, Glen Lyon shouted, "Halt!" He had just been shown a letter, found on Inverriggen's person, from John Hill promising Inverriggen the protection of the very soldiers who had just murdered him. Thomas Drummond, however, was distinctly unmoved. "Why is he still alive? What of our orders? Kill him!" Glen Lyon would not, so Drummond took out his own pistol and shot the boy in the head. A child ran out of the darkness, holding Glen Lyon's legs and begging for mercy, saying that he would go anywhere with the Campbell if his life was pardoned. He was promptly shot on Drummond's command. The men went on to bayonet the townsfolk in their beds or drag them out to be shot on the dung heap. They killed a woman and a boy of 4 years old. They turned loose the MacDonalds' livestock and looted the houses before setting the roof thatch ablaze and watching them burn. At Inverriggen, I saw 8 persons killed and several homes burnt, and women flying to the hills to save their lives, James Campbell testified in the later hearing. At Achnacona, Sergeant Barber had his men methodically slaughter their kindly hosts of the last 13 days. MacDonald of Achnacona and MacDonald of Achtrichten were seated with around 7 others when their doors were kicked open and muskets forced through the windows. 18 shots were fired into the room nearly simultaneously, killing Achtrichten and wounding Achnacona, whom Barber callously turned upon his back with his foot. "Are you still alive then?" "I am alive," Achnacona said, "and if I am to be killed by you, I would rather it were not beneath my own roof," showing surprisingly good grammar considering the situation. "I've eaten your meat," Barber smirked in ridicule of the Highland Code of Honour, "so I'll do you the favour and kill you without." Achnacona was taken outside and thrown against the wall of the house to be shot, the soldiers coming so close to him as to have him literally at gunpoint. In a move befitting Indiana Jones, however, Achnacona threw his plaid over their heads and ran, while the other wounded men in the house escaped via the back door. Barber was merciless. He had his men hack and slaughter all before them, as the residents ran from their doors straight into blade or bullet. Beginning to tire from the slaughter, they decided to instead burn 14 alive in a cottage, and also murdered a small child and a man of 80. Achtrichten, the clachan of the bards itself, met a similar fate. The junior sergeants Hendry and Purdy were in command here, and among their troops was a man apparently taking great satisfaction in his work. Every stab of the bayonet or shot to the back accompanied by a "That's for Colin's cows" or "That's for Catherine's blanket." The elderly Ranald of the Shield, if still alive, would have been killed, though his sons escaped, along with the renowned bards Ian MacRanal Og and Angus MacAllister Rui. Women and children fled onto the steep, windswept slopes of Bityan Nambayan towards Coorgaval, the Valley of the Bounty, where instead of stolen cattle, they now concealed themselves. To the east, the pass of Glen Coe was at this time still a ravine of slippery rocks and ice, all but impassable for the elderly, the very young, or women with child, but some men likely made it out this way, and so to the southern passes of the Larrig Eltia or Larrig Garten. Those who couldn't run, however, met a swifter demise at the end of a dirk or bayonet. Such cheap quarry as defenceless women and children were deemed unworthy of even a bullet. This was the depravity that the Master of Stair had all too knowingly unleashed upon the Highlands. The genie would not be forced back into its lamp. Eventually, the blizzard abated. A pale dawn began to break across the glen, revealing the dreadful remnants of the morning's atrocities. From Carnoch, Lieutenant Lindsay noted the approach of Duncanson and his men marching along the south shore towards them. It was 7 of the clock, and the massacre was over. The men were dead or scattered, the women and children huddled and shivering in the high corries, having had no time to dress appropriately. Many would die from exposure to the biting wind and frost of the morning, while the body of MacIain lay on display before the big house with his face blown off, his trews around his ankles, and his possessions and cattle being looted by the soldiers of Lindsay's company. As the sun slowly rose behind Bucheliet Moor, the grey light revealed the blood on the snow, the smouldering turf houses of Achtrichten, the bodies of the men of Achnacona and Inverrigan scattered around their burning and charred residences, the wind carrying the smell of peat smoke, and the pallor of death on the air. Arriving at Carnoch, Duncanson regarded the body of MacIain from his horse and asked Lindsay where he could find the bodies of MacIain's sons. Lindsay told him that no one had seen them, much to Duncanson's displeasure. He continued on to Inverrigan, likely cursing the useless drunkard Glenlyon. When he arrived, Glenlyon confirmed that there had been no sighting of John or Alistair MacDonald, dead or alive. Duncanson and Glenlyon knew that the brothers could not have been killed. The killer would have been quick to display his handiwork, and to claim any associated reward after all. Duncanson looked east, but he knew that the pass of Glen Coe lay unguarded. No one could have made it over the high pass through the night's storm. Hamilton's 400 men of Hill's regiment had left Fort William in the early evening of the 12th, planning on taking the high drove roads to Kinlochleven and then over the Devil's Staircase into Glen Coe, a trek of roughly around 20 miles. Now this is a tall order in winter even today, and in a blizzard? Forget it. By the time the men had reached Kinlochleven, they were exhausted and bedraggled, on the verge of revolt. Hamilton knew he could not drive them any further, and likely he didn't fancy the Devil's Staircase himself in this blizzard. The 400 men took what shelter they could by the loch until dawn, whereupon they continued the march in the improved conditions. When they finally came down to Achtrichten, Hamilton, no doubt in a foul mood, had the remaining houses burned, and reaching Inverrigan, was dismayed to hear that the old fox's cubs had escaped the slaughter. Both Duncanson and Hamilton likely told Robert Campbell exactly what they thought of his sloppiness in no uncertain terms. Glenlyon had turned out to be the fall guy all right, but not in the way they had wished. The surviving MacDonalds watched the soldiers gradually depart from their hiding places in Coorgaval, Curanlochan, Coronambea and Glenlaic na Muya. The brothers MacIain and the remaining Glensfolk gradually escaped into glens nearby, to live wild as fugitives, desperate and hunted. They would not return to Glen Coe for some time. The soldiers had departed for Fort William, loaded with loot and driving the MacDonalds' livestock, no less than 900 cows, 200 horses and many sheep and goats before them. Behind them, they left Glen Coe in a deathly silence. The foe was cruel indeed. Much is made of how the soldiers had, quote, no choice. Stair had made the consequences of dereliction of duty clear in his missives to Hamilton and Duncanson, the latter of whom, in his soon-to-be infamous order to Glenlyon, had forwarded these sentiments with even less subtlety, as you love yourself indeed. But, like John Hill's pointless moral hand-wringing over his signature, the point was academic. They still did what they did. We know that at least 3 men did refuse to carry out the criminal orders. An officer named Robert Stewart fled the glen when he heard of this final solution, while Francis Farquhar and Gilbert Kennedy of Hamilton's company broke their swords in protest at Kinlochleven when they were informed of their dark duty. None of these men were executed for treason or even charged. If Glenlyon had refused to carry out the order, he would probably have been exiled at most. The perpetrators didn't want scrutiny, but they would soon face it. As we're about to see, this atrocity carried out in the name of King William produced a great deal of what we would now call middle-class guilt among the Dutchman's new subjects. He was obliged to call an inquiry into what had caused this terrible state of affairs, but, as we know, he was very much aware of what and who had caused it, especially if, for example, he was anywhere near a mirror. The resulting investigation was perhaps the first example of a governmental whitewashing, where those who committed the crime are also the ones investigating it. Nevertheless, the very fact that it had forced a public inquiry at all was testament to how far news had spread across Europe of this heinous crime in the name of the Prince of Orange, and of how much British politics itself was beginning to change with the increasing power of Parliament. At Fort William, upon the soldiers' return, seeing their loot and unseemly sense of pride, John Hill was disgusted. He wrote to Livingston and Tweeddale with a statement that many Williamites would have considered triumphant, but Hill likely felt ashamed to admit it. "Their goods are a prey to the soldiers," he wrote, "and their houses to the fire. I have ruined Glen Coe." Ironically, at the time, the storm of scandal and revulsion over the massacre was largely external. The MacDonalds of Glen Coe knew that they had committed crimes for which they would more likely than not receive some kind of retribution, and thus did not see the massacre as particularly egregious in context. Indeed, unlike in the case of Black Duncan's attempted genocide of the MacGregors of Breadalbane as we saw in Series 1, the MacDonalds were permitted to return to their land, at least for a while. The widespread public outcry over the cold-blooded mass murder was chiefly motivated not by humanitarian concern, but by, you guessed it, politics. True to his character, Breadalbane wasted no time in trying to protect his reputation. Several days after the massacre, a man arrived in Appin asking to speak to John MacDonald. He had come from Loch Tay and was here on a matter of great importance. Once it had been established that the man was genuine and unarmed, he was escorted to the secret dwelling of John MacDonald, who now inherited the title of MacIain, 13th Chief of the MacDonalds of Glen Coe. The traveller was a representative of Alexander Campbell of Balcarden, Chamberlain no less to John Campbell, Earl of Breadalbane. What Grey John had deemed more important than attending his bedchamber was to offer a deal that if the MacDonalds swore on oath that Breadalbane had no complicity in the massacre, Grey John would use all of his political and legislative power to ensure the MacDonalds were given a full pardon and restitution. John MacDonald shook his head. Just how stupid did Breadalbane think they were? John Hill expected a reprisal. The troops of his and Argyll's regiments were kept at Fort William in Maryborough, while the MacDonald livestock were sorted into those to be kept and those to be sold. Rumour was that John and Alistair Oge had armed themselves and their men in the hills of Appin, and that the Stewarts of the area had been greatly angered by the plight of the women and children from Glen Coe that they had granted asylum. However, much to Hill's delight, instead of violent reprisal, the chiefs wanted peace. Robert Stewart of Appin arrived at Fort William in dreadful health, asking to take the oath to William, and begged forgiveness for not coming sooner due to his illness. More chiefs or their representatives began to arrive. The massacre had seemingly worked to convince the clans to play nice. Burlins arrived daily at Maryborough, bearing men more fearful than fierce. These included Clan Ranald, MacNeil of Barra, and even the MacDonalds of Sleat on Skye. "They come from all parts to submit to the King's mercy," Hill joyfully reported to Livingston, "and to take the oath of allegiance and, according to my orders, save their lives. I hope this example of justice and severity will be enough." It was not justice the clansmen feared, however, but further severity. They had no reason to believe that they would not be the next to be, to use the new common parlance, Glen Coed. The MacDonalds of Glen Coe, now refugees in Appin, were relying only on the charity of the Stewarts of Appin for sustenance, the great MacDonald houses making the political choice to ignore their kinsfolk's plight, likely out of self-preservation. Only Archibald MacDonald of Grimmish sent aid, steering a boatload of grain from his tiny island of Monach, 6 miles west of North Uist, to the shores of Appin. John Hill petitioned the government to help them, and while as usual his concern was genuine, it was delivered through the prism of state security. Those men of Glen Coe that, by the help of the storm, escaped, would submit to mercy if their lives may be granted them. Upon giving security to live peaceably under the government, and not to rob, steal, or receive stolen goods hereafter, and I humbly conceive, since there are enough killed for an example, and to vindicate public justice, it were advisable to receive them, since it will be troublesome to take them, the Highlanders being generally allied to one another, and they may join with other broken men and be hurtful to the country. At the present they, the men of Glen Coe, lie dormant in caves and remote places. Not for the first time, the practical suggestions of Hill were ignored. Instead, he was hearing talk that offended his delicate sense of pride and moral fortitude. It was said that he and his officers had exceeded their remit and gone further than the King's orders had commanded them to. He wrote to the Marquis of Tweeddale, an influential Williamite loyalist who currently had the King's ear. "I understand that there are some severe reflections made upon the action in Glen Coe, and that perhaps by many good men too. Therefore I think it my duty to give your lordship a more particular account thereof. I had several orders from London, and also several orders from the Commander-in-Chief, and all extraordinary strict, to destroy these people and take no prisoners, and, lest I should prove remiss, Another of the same orders was directed to my lieutenant colonel to do the same. And after all that, another order upon the king's hand to root out that sept of thieves. It wasn't his fault, he was only following orders. This was a more credible legal defence in the 1600s than in our post-Nuremberg world, but the fact remained that such an argument would be disproven by Farquhar and Kennedy breaking their swords at Kinlochleven rather than following their orders. The irony, however, was that had Hill resigned his commission rather than sign the orders, it would only have accelerated, not hindered the massacre. The scandalous 13 days of hospitality would have been 3 at most, had Livingston's orders not been so delayed in implementation. Hill does himself no favours in this hour, however, making implicit the suggestion that, after all, perhaps the MacDonalds had had it coming. In their lawlessness and foraging of others' lands, they had brought this sorry calamity upon themselves. If any censure the severity of man's justice, he wrote to Tweeddale, yet the justice of God is to be reverenced, for there was much blood on these people's hands. This ugly implication, used in the years to come to justify the Highland clearances, shows a casual contempt for the Gaeltacht common among Lowlanders and Englishmen, completely ignoring the fact that, from the Gaelic perspective, the MacDonalds had actually been robbed of their lands by the state in the first place, and had their intelligence and ancient heritage disregarded by those in power, and stacked against such grievances, their much discussed acts of foray and rebellion were ultimately rather trivial in comparison. But of course, as we know, history is written not by the oppressed, but by the oppressor. As word of the massacre reached Edinburgh, Jacobite supporters seized upon the matter, igniting a public mood of disgust for the atrocity by spreading the news with particular emphasis on the cruelty of the redcoats. Their primary source was none other than the old soak, Glen Lyon himself. Argyll's regiment of foot were now to be deployed to Flanders against the French, and had arrived in Edinburgh from Fort William to be quartered in Leith before marching southward. Glen Lyon spoke openly in taverns and coffee houses of the act he had committed. "I would do it again," he cried. "I would dirk any man in Scotland and England, without asking cause, if the king gave me orders." Perhaps seeing the anger in the eyes of his audience, he added, "So should any good subject of his majesty." While such bluster was likely simply a means of having drinks bought for him, he was letting slip key information that eavesdroppers of Jacobite persuasion were spreading like wildfire. It was the king's order. Stair, Breadalbane and John Hill were all complicit, and he may have even spoken of Duncanson and Hamilton's tardiness with the implication they had not his guts for the task at hand. But he also spoke of how he had only followed his orders with the deepest regret, that he had killed Inverriggen only under duress, and that he felt a great guilt over the matter. This was likely closer to the truth. He showed Drummond's orders to all, and even let it be copied and circulated by the Jacobites. At this, Breadalbane was apoplectic. He cursed the loose-lipped Glen Lyon and moved to dispel any suggestion that he had been complicit, boring his friends and colleagues with his protestations of innocence. He was overstating things, of course. He may not have been privy to Stair's darkest designs, but he was hardly an innocent bystander in the matter either. That his protestations of innocence were fatally undermined by the fact his cousin and heavy debtor had been the executioner in Glen Coe only exacerbated his hatred for Glen Lyon. Breadalbane too feared reprisal. What, he asked Argyle without a shred of irony, if the Glen Coe men come back in revenge upon innocent Campbells like ourselves? Argyle simply shrugged. Then I hope the king will protect them. Soon the Paris Gazette, one of the most important news publications of the day, carried an explosive report of the Glen Coe Massacre in what would now be called a front-page spread, and this would have been perused by political elites all over Europe. Here in this shameful slaughter, it proclaimed, was the true face of the enemy. The Laird of Glen Coe was butchered several days ago in the most barbarous manner, although he was amenable to the present government. The Laird of Glen Lyon, a captain in Argyll's regiment, following the explicit orders of Colonel Hill, governor of Inverlochy, went at night to Glen Coe with a body of soldiers, and the soldiers, having entered the houses, killed the Laird of Glen Coe, 2 of his sons, 36 men or children and 4 women. It had been resolved in this manner to wipe out the rest of the inhabitants, notwithstanding the amnesty that had been granted them, but about 200 escaped. It has been rumoured that the Laird was killed in an ambush with his weapons in his hands, in order to diminish the horror of so barbarous an action, which would have made all nations see what little trust can be placed on the words of those who rule. Though there are obvious inaccuracies, the report was correct in describing several of the main events. Today it's estimated that around 38 people were killed in the actual massacre itself, though the total casualties rise to around 72 when including those who perished through exposure to the elements. The sources for the Paris Gazette report were Jacobites in Edinburgh, who had obtained both Duncanson's and Hamilton's orders. Now, in terms of realpolitik, these Jacobites were not so much disgusted by the massacre as they were emboldened and determined to use it as a lance with which to skewer William and what they perceived as his illegitimate reign. They were joined by the legion of enemies the Master of Stair had made in his ascent to power, who now enthusiastically worked, euphemistically speaking of course, to dig the Dalrymple's grave. Around the 12th of April, Breadalbane left London for Loch Tay, just as copies of the Paris Gazette began to arrive, prompting freelance journalists such as the verbose Irish pamphleteer Charles Leslie to write to Scotland for further details, then publish a lengthy article that, despite few printers wishing to run it, and it's thus ending up on an obscure pamphlet about the Protestant Church in Ireland, would begin to circulate widely as the scandal broke across the city. Leslie's letter from a gentleman in Scotland contained numerous testimonies as well as the full orders given by Hamilton and Duncanson. But Leslie's reporting in the Jacobites' rumour mill resulted more in just having people talk about it than posing any serious problem for William. Most in the establishment likely just didn't see why it was a big deal, so a bunch of primitive savages had been cleared out. Wasn't that progress? Those more attuned to the public mood, however, realised that this had the potential to undermine the moral legitimacy of William's reign. If he had ordered this, he could not exactly be considered ethically superior to the exiled James II and VII, who, while a Catholic, would have at least respected the Highland Code of Honour. The casual, disinterested manner in which the massacre had been ordered, and in which news of its outcome was now being received by William and the Dutchmen in his court, would have curdled the stomach of even his blandest enabler. Stair was unmoved by the outcry. He took little interest in the public's horror at the massacre. It's true that the affair of Glen Coe was very ill executed, he said, but 'tis strange to me that means so much regret for such a sept of thieves. Even now, he still sought the eradication of the Glen Coe MacDonalds from Scotland, writing to Tweeddale and Hill, "The King has ordered me to write to your lordship and to Colonel Hill that he is willing to pardon them, they going abroad to the plantations, Ireland, or any place else, but he will not allow them to settle in their old quarter, which is so commodious for their thieving trade. I fancy they will be glad of what's allowed, having their lives safe, and more cannot in the will of the country be asked." Hill did not pass on the message to John MacDonald that his only hope was to be sent to a plantation as essentially a slave. Instead, he pleaded with the Privy Council to offer the MacDonalds more reasonable terms, and by August, The proposal to ship out the Glen Coe MacDonalds to the plantations was finally discarded. Hill was told the king would allow the people of Glen Coe to return to their glen upon their swearing allegiance to William. Again. John MacDonald was not a man looking for more bloodshed, and happily agreed to these terms. Alistair Oge was less forgiving and refused to take the oath until October. Upon their return to Glen Coe, the brothers planted a tree on the spot where their father's body had been cast to the ground outside Carnoch. Among those looking to use Glen Coe to bury the political career of the Master of Stair was James Johnston of Warriston, who wrote to Tweeddale of the dreadful dealings of the Master, while being careful not to imply the king had had any hand in the affair, so as to protect his own career prospects. But nothing came of the public outcry or the various machinations against Stair. His enemies were still unable to inflict any serious injury upon his standing or position. By now he lied so blithely it was almost a formality. For the last, I know nothing of it. I'm sure neither you nor anybody empowered to treat or give indemnity did give him the oath, and to take it from anybody else after the diet elapsed did import nothing. All I regret is that any of the sept got away. Livingston was similarly unrepentant. It's not that anybody thinks the thieving tribe did not deserve to be destroyed, he told Hamilton in 1693, but that it should have been done by such that were quartered amongst them makes a great noise. By 1695, Johnston's campaign against Stair had become an open war. Now joint Secretary of State for Scotland with Stair, he railed against the Master's dark dealings and rightly accused him of placing his hatred of the MacDonalds above his duty to king and country. Johnston called for a public inquiry into the massacre, not out of any sense of social justice, but because in this manner Stair could be removed and William exonerated. For 3 years he had collected information and evidence on the massacre, sending his findings on to the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Scottish Parliament, by now teetering on the edge of irrelevance, had been greatly irritated by William's indifference to Scotland beyond an interest in its resources. They too were determined to hold an inquiry. Surprisingly, the king had anticipated their wishes. The Parliament were astonished when the Lord High Chancellor, the King's Commissioner to Parliament John Hay, Marquis of Tweeddale himself, addressed them in person to impart that William was, quote, pondering what method will be the most effective for obtaining full information about the massacre of certain people surnamed MacDonald and others of Glen Coe in the year 1692. He had ordered a commission of inquiry, but of course this was to be made up of his most loyal acolytes. There wasn't a chance in hell of William actually being implicated for his rather significant part in the atrocity. The Parliament, its wishes sated, was obliged to wait for this commission to produce its report and hope that they might be furnished with a non-redacted copy. The commission sat in Holyrood House during the summer of 1695, interviewing witnesses and compiling the evidence. They heard the testimonies of John Hill, John Forbes, James Campbell, Francis Farquhar and Gilbert Kennedy. Further depositions were given by Colin Campbell of Dresselch, Colin Campbell of Ardkinglass and by Sir Gilbert Elliot, clerk to the Privy Council. Dresselch was a member of the Privy Council who had objected to MacIain's inclusion on the register of oath-takers, while it seems very likely that Gilbert Elliot was the one who actually struck MacIain's name from said register. As mentioned in Knives in the Dark, The Commission deemed this to have been a clerical error, and if you believe that, I'll have a used car to sell you. John MacDonald and Alistair Oge were joined by 8 other MacDonalds of Glen Coe in giving evidence before the inquiry. The Commission did not, however, interrogate Hamilton, Duncanson, Drummond or Barber, who were by now in action on the continent. The report of the Commission was that Stair and Glenlyon, and thus the men serving under them, had exceeded their orders in carrying out the massacre. William's orders had been fair and just, of course, the Commission claimed, but the implementation of them had been carried out with excessive brutality and as part of personal vendettas. Breadalbane, meanwhile, received some pretty swift justice. He was thrown in the Tolbooth in Edinburgh Castle for supposedly agreeing to the private articles of a Challador. That is, as viewers may recall from last time, his alleged agreement with the clan chiefs to support the Jacobite cause if James II and VII ever returned to Scotland in force. That the politically sophisticated Breadalbane would have agreed to such a scheme seems highly unlikely, given the man that had provided the evidence for this accusation, Glengarry, hated Breadalbane's guts. In any case, he wasn't behind bars for long. In August he was pardoned by William himself, who, as we saw last time, seemed to consider such shameless double-dealing, imagined or not, as par for the course in politics. Breadalbane thus returned to Loch Tay to nurse his wounded reputation. John Hill was fully exonerated by the inquiry despite his quote, just following orders defence. Livingston too was held to have had no knowledge of MacIain's having taken the oath, though this was a falsehood and his pardon likely just the result of allies lobbying on his behalf. But there was no such escape for Stair, who had few if any allies left to protect him from the serious charges he had been found guilty of. He cannily chose to resign his Secretaryship of State for Scotland before he was pushed, but faced no jail time. William, irritated at being told by the inquiry who he could and could not vilify, stopped short of reinstating Stair, but he did publicly exonerate him in a particularly tin-eared manner, saying such a fine upstanding gentleman couldn't have been involved in this act that was, quote, contrary to the laws of humanity and hospitality. What would you know about those? Just about everyone knew that Stair was guilty as sin, and if they did not know, most were glad that he had been found as such. The Scottish Parliament's address to the King touching the murder of the Glen Coe men, however, was a much harsher and unflinching version of the Commission's report. It officially condemned the atrocity as murder under trust, with Stair declared the original cause of this unhappy business, which, given William was never going to be indicted, is fairly close to the truth. Stair's younger brother tried to throw the Argyll regiment under the bus in an effort to clear his sibling's name with the publication of the pamphlet Information for the Master of Stair. Though the command of superior officers be very absolute, yet no command against the laws of nature is binding, so that a soldier, retaining his commission, ought to refuse to execute any barbarity, as if a soldier should be commanded to shoot a man passing by inoffensively upon the street. No such command would exempt him from the punishment of murder. This was rightly perceived as being opportunistic and in very poor taste, and Hugh Dalrymple was dragged before Parliament and forced to apologise. Lieutenant Colonel James Hamilton was also found to be complicit in the planning of the massacre, but he ignored the summons to appear before the inquiry. Parliament was incensed by this, quite rightly, and a warrant was issued for his arrest. However, Hamilton had the brass neck to write to Parliament to say that he didn't want to come to Edinburgh because he didn't think he would be treated fairly. Ah, the irony. Somehow, i.e. by the Secretary of State Johnston, he was given a free pass to go to Holland, and soon appeared in Waterloo serving with the Scots Regiment in the Dutch army. John Dalrymple, the Master of Stair, and Archibald Campbell, Earl of Argyll, would be back a decade later to meddle in political affairs to great effect once more during the saga that led to the greatly controversial Act of Union in 1707, but that's a story for another time. Other, quote, actors in the slaughter of the Glen Coe men under trust were Robert Duncanson, Captain Thomas Drummond, Lieutenant Lindsay, Ensign Lundy, and Sergeant Barber. Parliament demanded their return from Flanders to face their punishment, but it turned out, even in the unlikely event William had seen fit to entertain such a demand, this was impossible. The men had been cheaply and shamefully surrendered at Dixmude by their general officer, and now enjoyed the hospitality of Louis XIV's soldiery as prisoners of war. Viewers may be pleased to know that this is where we begin to see some justice occur. Upon their release, none were hit harder by the surrender than the spectacularly unlucky Robert Duncanson. Just 10 days before the terrible capitulation, Duncanson had bought brand new uniforms for the entire regiment, leaving a debt of over £1,000, a huge private sum at that time, owed to a now somewhat frosty Edinburgh clothier. Upon Duncanson's return to Edinburgh in 1696, with little more than the shirt on his back, said creditor duly had him thrown in the Tolbooth, where he remained until 1697, when the Argyll regiment was finally disbanded and Argyll himself bought Duncanson out of jail. Duncanson would be shot dead 8 years later at the siege of Valencia de Alcantara, and as I think we can all agree, he certainly had it coming. Captain Thomas Drummond would also suffer misfortune that the viewer will likely find deeply satisfying. When the Argyll regiment was disbanded, he joined the new Company of Scotland Trading. This endeavour was a disastrous attempt by moneyed Edinburgh aristocrats to ape the East India Company and establish a Scottish empire. No, seriously. Drummond was sent to the first and only Scottish colony of Darien in Panama, a miserable, disease-ridden hellhole from which few returned. Just Google it, you'll see what he was in for. John Hill continued to govern at Fort William until his discharge in 1698 on half pay of £168 a year as a colonel and captain of foot. His long service saw him receive a knighthood, but this was of little comfort in his lonely twilight years. Hill returned to England, where he died, likely still bearing his sense of shame for the ruin of Glen Coe. After his release as a prisoner of war, Robert Campbell, Glenlyon himself, died a pauper in 1696 in Bruges, leaving a considerable debt that his family back in Chesthill Cottage in Glenlyon could not hope to repay. His last act had been to ruin them too. Robert Campbell's death may have been hastened by the Uisce, but it's also likely that the reported haunted look in his eyes that he carried after the massacre revealed an awareness of the extent of the horror that he had unleashed 4 years earlier on the bloodied snow of Inverriggen, Carnock, Brecklit, Larach and Achtrichten. For the record, we can say with near certainty that ultimate responsibility for the massacre lay with King William, John Stair Dalrymple, James Hamilton and Robert Duncanson. It was these men, none of them Campbells, that masterminded the atrocity. The crime was committed by men who may well have felt that they had no choice, but this does not excuse the enthusiasm with which the likes of Robert Barber or Thomas Drummond carried out their directive. These and the other officers present may be considered equally guilty of what we would now term war crimes. Nevertheless, Hamilton and Duncanson, and no doubt Stairs, planned to have Robert Campbell seen as the chief villain worked. To this day, the common assumption is that Glen Coe was the result of clan feuding, that the cruel, inhuman Campbells had exacted a terrible revenge on their bitter rivals. If you take one thing away from this film, let it be that this is a misleading and mendacious falsehood. As long-time viewers will know, there are no shortage of heinous acts that can be attributed solely to Clan Campbell, but not this. The truth of the matter is that the MacDonalds of Glen Coe were murdered because they were Jacobites. Forever violated, the MacDonalds of Glen Coe returned to the Glen of the Dogs, but in reduced number and with little security. In truth, their time was running out. Gaelic Highland culture now faced a new enemy, one more cynical and cold-blooded than even the master of Stair himself: capitalism. This was a foe that even Finn McCool could not have defeated. Only 50 years remained for the Gaeltacht until the disaster of Culloden would annihilate the Jacobite resistance once and for all. The Scottish Highlands would be increasingly exploited, riven to the bone by the ravages of industry in the name of lowland profit. The ancient Caledonian forests would burn, the Gaels would be scoured from the glens and replaced by sheep, and the Highlands itself would become a business enterprise, empty, silent, and pacified at last. It was the dawn of the Industrial Age, and sunset for the Gaeltacht. Thanks for your time. Really hope you enjoyed the film. If you did, feel free to like, share and comment, as that really helps the channel to grow, and that means more free content like this for you to enjoy. We'll see you next time, and for now, enjoy your adventures.